Good evening, welcome to Simpson at 8. We are seeing a heightened engagement of foreign powers in Fiji and the Pacific as the US and Australia and China tussle for geopolitical influence and strategic influence in the region. In February, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a quick stopover in Fiji, the first visit of a high-ranking US official in Fiji for over 4 decades. And in this last week, we had the dueling visits of the newly elected Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. What has caused this renewed interest and maneuvering, and what does this all mean for Fiji and the Pacific? I am joined by the head of school and director of politics and international affairs at the University of the South Pacific, Professor Sandra Tarte. Welcome to Simpson at 8.
Thank you.
So, now we all know that US and Australia and China have been competing for strategic influence in the Pacific for some time, but this kind of looks like it's really gone up a notch to another level. So in the last 6 months, what has sparked this?
The end of COVID and the fact that we have started to reopen borders in the region, I think has been the trigger for this sudden flurry of high-level visits to Fiji and the region. I think the period when we had the COVID closures with the pandemic was a period where we could pause a little, reflect, but for certain traditional powers in the region, it was an opportunity for them to really, I guess, step in and establish that they were the ones providing the relief from COVID, particularly the vaccines. Most of the vaccines that Fiji received are from Australia, New Zealand, the US, Japan, either through COVAX or directly or with partnership with UNICEF. And what we're seeing now as the borders reopen is, I think, the traditional partners wanting to maintain that momentum and China perhaps trying to catch up.
Okay, because there is a view that China had gained momentum and had gained a foothold above Australia and Australia and the US up to before COVID, and had gained sort of like the camel entering the tent, so to speak, to use an analogy. But did COVID provide an opportunity for Australia and the US to kind of regain the momentum? What's your assessment to that?
Yes, I think it did, but it was also, I think, continuing a trend that we've seen, right? If you want to go back a little bit in time, China's been on the rise for some decades now, but particularly since probably around 2013, 2014, China under the president Xi Jinping adopted this Belt and Road strategy or initiative, and really started to reach out, to developing countries in particular, including the Pacific, and this period saw, a much more heightened engagement by China through aid, through trade, through diplomacy, and so on. And it led around 2018 to countries such as Australia and New Zealand starting to become a bit worried, that they were losing the upper hand in the Pacific to China's growing influence. But you have to probably keep in mind too that Australia, particularly for Australia, the domestic politics in Australia was driving this. There were deepening concerns in Australia about China's influence domestically in Australia, and this started to feed into their foreign policy and started to raise concerns about what China was up to in the Pacific. So from 2018 onwards, you've seen Australia and New Zealand launch strategies of their own, to really step up, as they called it, in the Pacific through more aid, through more engagement, and through high-level meetings, and so on. So this was a trend that really began before COVID, and I think has sort of escalated
up to now. Because I'm looking at the situation in Fiji as you're describing that, Sandra, that the period after the 2006 coup, when diplomatic ties between Fiji and Australia and New Zealand was strained, and the interim Bainimarama government looked towards China, that looked North policy, and basically we started to take a lot of Chinese loans towards development, and I think China gained momentum in Fiji, at least at that time. A lot of big momentum.
China was Fiji's best friend, but you have to remember that from 2009, Fiji was suspended from the Pacific Islands Forum, from the Commonwealth, because of the abrogation of the Constitution. We were kind of isolated, okay? And our traditional partners were shunning Fiji. As a result of that, under the Bainimarama government, there was a kind of new initiative to reorient Fiji's foreign relations. It was called Look North, but in fact it was look everywhere. Look to China, look to India, look to the Middle East, Africa, and so on. And so our partnerships diversified quite considerably. And that was so Fiji could survive, in this more hostile environment that it was in. And it paid off. Fiji was very proactive. You could look at the UN, look at what we achieved there. And it also meant Fiji gained a lot of confidence in its dealings with its partners. So what you see is Fiji is not interested in being anyone's best friend, really. It wants to be good friends with as many countries as possible, but big powers in particular. So China is important, US is important.
Yeah. And in many ways, Australia and New Zealand started to gain the initiative of the 2014 elections to support. But I think China had already had that influence. I think there is a view, and I want to hear what you think, that the Australia and New Zealand, the US, kind of neglected the region for some time and slept on the job. Would that be correct, or is that too harsh?
I think it's not really reflective of recent times. And since the so-called step up, and even before then with Australia, I mean, there's been a recognition that obviously, they need to take the region more seriously. New Zealand has been always perhaps doing that, but that sort of shifted a bit too. They wanted to pay more attention. No, I don't think they were sleeping. I think they were doing a lot. And you see the relationship with Fiji and Australia, the security partnerships, the economic, the political. There was always tension, particularly with the Morrison government, with climate change, right? And I think
they lost a lot of ground with climate change.
And you saw Bainimarama and other leaders calling out, the Morrison government on this issue at the Pacific Island leaders' meetings. And they were not scared. They really, spoke truth to power. So that was one of the things that they disagreed on, though.
All right, before we go to the break, COVID provided an opportunity to reset, did it?
I would say yes.
Because, I mean, it renewed a lot of this Vuvale partnership and things. Maybe we'll talk about that after we come back from the break.
Don't forget the Duavata partnership.
The Duavata and the Vuvale partnership. We'll discuss that after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Simpson at 8 with Dr. Sandra Tarte from the University of the South Pacific, talking about the recent geopolitical moves happening in Fiji and the region. So before we went to the break, we were talking about the Duavata and the Vuvale partnerships. How effective do you think that's been?
Well, the Vuvale, the references to that have become quite, very, very popularized. And it's not just the previous Australian government, it's the new one. And it's also not just applying to Fiji, it's being applied to the Pacific as, a way to say we are a family, and so we help each other. And it's quite interesting because it can be used to therefore exclude others. So, for example, when the Solomon Islands signed recently a security partnership with China, and part of that was to help respond to domestic, crises in the Solomons. The response from some of our partners was, well, it's not needed. We are the family. We help. China doesn't need
You're
to.
leaving the family.
Yes.
It was almost like Solomon Islands was a traitor to the region.
Well, that's part of the, there's a kind of, zero-sum thinking going on, but it's not necessarily the case.
Let's just come on to that, because that's really gained a lot of attention, became an big issue in the Australian elections. What did you make of the whole approach and the views? The thing that really concerned me was the lack of pushback from the region in terms of that a lot of the views was conveying to what the Australian narrative was, and not from what the Solomon Islands view was, of their, getting their view. I just wanted to, what was your take on that whole, which is still ongoing in many ways.
Well, it was extremely alarmist, in its in the kind of reporting and responses that were being given to that, this agreement, and I think it echoes what happened back in 2018 when there was suddenly some suggestion made about Vanuatu, establishing a military base for China in Vanuatu, as a part of Vanuatu and China aid. And that idea of a military base, which has now been echoed in the Solomon Islands case, has just kind of sends these shockwaves throughout the Australian and New Zealand and US and Japanese establishments. It's kind of like, no, you can't ever consider that. But in the Solomons case, I don't think that was ever on the cards. And more worrying for the Solomons is that domestically there is not a strong kind of support or consensus around the relationship with China.
It's a governance issue more.
Yeah, and it was only recently that Solomon switched its allegiance to China from Taiwan. And there is still discord around that. So it's the rippling effects within Solomon Islands which is more a worry, not any potential for a military base.
Yeah.
So,
I was also concerned that there was some really strong language that was used, and it wasn't. But some of it was, I felt, was Australian government, the previous Australian government, and some of the thing was talking about actually even about taking over the Solomon Islands. There was some strong language from the U.S. about consequences should. So I mean, it was a very unhealthy kind of language to be to have in the Pacific.
It's reflective of the attitudes, I think, of some of these, the leaders in some of these countries, that it is still very paternalistic, right? That they can, in a sense, determine, who our friends are, and what the choices are that we make. And I think our Prime Minister, Mr. Bainimarama, has been very forthright in, declaring, well, actually, we make those decisions for ourselves in our own interests. And I think he mentioned just the other day, we're not a backyard. This is our region. And I think what's very interesting in this recent visit of the Chinese Foreign Minister coming with a plan for the countries in the region to sign on to is the response that, no, we don't sign anybody's plan. We determine the priorities for our region. If countries like China want to engage with us, we determine what those priorities and areas of interest are that we will engage with.
Okay.
We're not being, in a sense, driven by others' agendas here.
Because I'll come and talk about China in a while, but I wanted to touch about Australia because, as I said before earlier, that they kind of lost a lot of ground with the Pacific with their position on climate change. This has frustrated many Pacific Island countries over the years. I was listening to Penny Wong, last week when she came, the new foreign minister, and this government seems to have a more climate change friendly approach. How do you think that'll help? Will it go a long way? Because I think it's one of the big issues for the region.
Well, look, I think Australia has very, at the moment, I think good relations with the region. I mean, there's a few, I guess, areas that, in Solomons, the whole kind of furor of the China deal. But yes, as our biggest partner on many things, climate was always that kind of issue that divided.
Sore thumb.
That sore thumb. This government, it promises to bring a very different approach, but of course it's a domestic issue in the Australian context. It's not just a foreign policy issue, and what needs to happen obviously is change within Australia, and enough Australians, which seems to be starting to happen, making this a political, issue.
Yeah, because Penny Wong did say that under past governments, Australia has neglected its responsibilities on climate change. These were her words, and disrespecting Pacific nations in their struggle to adapt to what is an existential threat. Harsh words for her predecessors, one would say. She's keen, perhaps, to point out that it's a very different Australian government, talking about really being part of the Vuvale, the Pacific family.
Yeah, I mean, they will probably do things differently in the region when it comes to climate and, in terms of aid and so on. But what counts is what Australia does with its own emissions targets, and its own if you like, shift away from its reliance on fossil fuels.
Because unfortunately, one thing we've seen is they have put money. And I think in the past, like 10 years ago at the forum meetings, many years ago, we've seen Australia announce a few $1 million for this climate change initiative, but and $1 million for this initiative. But as you say, what's more important is what will be done on the ground in Australia in terms of emissions. And I think some commitments have been made on that, but we'll keep watch on that. One thing that's come through that I've noticed when we're talking about, when you talked about Bainimarama being, we will decide, is that both China and Australia have stated that their visits are not forced, that they will not be forcing anything on Fiji and the Pacific countries, both saying they're respective of the Pacific Island countries' sovereignty and their right to choose who you partner with. But the pressure is enormous, isn't it, with all the funding, the projects, the programs, and the partnerships being offered. So one would ask, does the Pacific really have a choice?
The Pacific definitely has choices. Our mantra has always been friends to all, enemies to none. I mean, some countries in the Pacific are probably unable to have lots of freedom when it comes to particularly defense and foreign policy because of their treaty ties, for example, to the US. But a country like Fiji, yeah, we have choices. And that's been one of the, I think, the results of our foreign policy over the last 15 years is establishing our independence, as an international actor. These visits, yes, they might be forced, they might seem to be put pressure on us, but hey, hang on, they are also opportunities for us to get the message across at that level,
There has also been talk that's come through that Pacific Island countries, some Pacific Island countries will be so reliant on China, that some of their major industries, some of their national industries will be taken up by China because of the huge debt. And many of us looking at the Pacific's debt trap to China that's been talked about. So some countries being talked about is Tonga.
That's the only one.
That's the only one. Okay. So, but is that a concern that you see as real?
I think debt is an issue for a lot of countries now because of particularly COVID, but not to China. And the debt trap scenario that people have painted has really not been, found to be true in many parts of the world even. So there has been a bit of scaremongering about that. And Tonga is the only case where you see quite a high level of debt to China, but that predates a lot of this.
So before we go to the break, and after the break we'll talk more about China. So I was in Australia recently, that was before the change in government, and the key message that was coming out, both from the former Pacific Minister Zedza Sezelja and the Shadow Minister Pat Conroy, was we are not going to try and force anything on the Pacific. We want to be a partner of choice. And as you see it now, are they gaining the foothold to be the partner of choice in the Pacific, particularly with the sports initiatives with the Fijian and Drua and the Fijian Drua, and the partnerships they're giving? I think they've been successful in that regard in terms of trying to become a partner of choice. Certainly that's working out for them in the sports arena, isn't it?
Definitely, but I think you have to look at security and defense as well. If you look at the initiatives in the recent past, with Australia funding BlackRock, funding our new Navy headquarters, with policing initiatives, maritime defense, from the US, there's a lot that's coming our way, and so they all want us to view them as their number one, partner.
And there's always been this talk in the past that the Pacific can gain a lot by there's a joke, that if you want Australia to fund something, use China, use the word China, and playing across each other. But and I mentioned that to the Australians, and they said, look, we don't want this to be a transactional relationship. We want it to be one that is more substantive and based on real friendship, rather than one where we it's just basically about who pays the most or who gives us the most. That's very important going forward.
Yeah, I think we all want that. Yeah.
All right. You're watching Simpson at 8. We're with Dr. Sandra Tarte from the University of the South Pacific. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Simpson 8. We're with Dr. Sandra Tarte, the head of School of Law and Social Sciences from the University of the South Pacific. Let's now come to China. And, there's a lot of talk about that the Pacific should be worried about China, the things that they do, but maybe we should ask that question straight out and get your view. Should the Pacific fear China?
Mm-hmm. The Pacific should fear any, I think, big power that turns out to be predatory and seeking to dominate and control the region. And that's any power. It doesn't have to be China or anyone. So I think we need to be mindful that we don't want a kind of situation in the Pacific where one superpower can call the shots. We want a region, I think, where there is some kind of balance.
Because the narrative that's coming out is I side with China, and that came out with the Solomon Islands situation. You side with China, or you are with the U.S., the Western powers.
But this is a Western region. It has been traditionally.
Yes.
We've got U.S., we've got the Australians, New Zealanders, the French. These are all, and Britain to some extent. We've got very strong ties with all of these countries, and it's relatively recent that we've got this non-Western power, China, becoming very influential and providing perhaps the only possible challenge, to these Western allies for some kind of dominance or sort of influence, if you like. So that's the fear, that there is going to be some kind of, if you like, curtailment of that Western sort of historical hegemony in the Pacific.
Well, historically, we have our people fought with this is a Western region. We fought and died and stood for the same causes. So what is it about China that concerns the U.S. and Australia?
Well, yeah, there's, in many ways, Australia, as you know, Australia is very dependent on China economically. It's got this dual kind of, it's a tension that they are very strong economically, sort of aligned to China, but politically and in terms of historical links and defense with the West, particularly the US. And, that's caused problems because now, as Australia-China relations have deteriorated, Australia's been put in a very difficult situation. You don't want to be, in a sense, held, to ransom. But I think the thing about China is that it's not a Western country. It doesn't have the same, as many would know, the same kind of political history, culture, democratic system. It's not open politically like Western countries are. So it doesn't, certainly for us in the Pacific, there's not the same Christian kind of heritage that we share with the West.
Well, the way they treat the media is a case in point with a recent visit. Fiji Media Association just put out a statement with regards the way the media were treated. There was not an opportunity to ask questions, as opposed to the way the Australian Foreign Minister gave us access last time.
But that's not China. I think that's the Fiji government wanting to ensure that things stay kind of under control. And I guess for any they don't want to be embarrassed. But yes, I think you're right that with these high-level
we'll work
visits,
out. But the Australians did push to have access and got the access, and all the media got asked. I did note that in the Antony Blinken U.S. Secretary of State visit, only one media organization was told to ask the question, and it was quite stifling as well.
It's very choreographed. Right?
Yeah.
And the Fiji government probably wants that, to ensure there's no unexpected things to, go wrong. That's my view.
So that's the issue of China. What would be the best way to approach China and to deal with China in terms of this whole thing and be able to balance everything out, to manage all the relationships?
Fiji has taken what I would call a very pragmatic approach, in the sense that China matters. China is an important partner for economic reasons, for political reasons. Fiji's had to make some concessions with China. One of them is to not give such prominence to Taiwan or the office, the Taiwan Trade Office that's here. The relationship has been downgraded somewhat. But of course, the big, the big condition with China is the one China policy, acceptance of the one China policy. And that means that you recognize China and the People's Republic of China as the government of China. There can be no other. And not to interfere in any of China's domestic affairs.
What are you seeing with this new pact, a new agreement that they tried to come, and get signed? They didn't succeed. I think there's some Pacific Island countries wanted some other issues ironed out. China is telling the Western powers do not interfere. They're only looking to widen their resource via the partnerships. China's development revitalization is common achievement. They say that they really just want to build access to more resources and vigorously safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of developing countries on the international stage. So it's almost the same kind of things that's being proposed by the US and Australia in plenty of their partnerships.
Yeah, China's relationships in the Pacific have always been bilateral, one-to-one. And they seem to want to shift that to a more regional focus and approach, which is what's actually happened with China's relationships in other regions, other developing countries such as Africa. So this is not necessarily new approach. And China's had high-level meetings in the past with regional leaders. So that they've had a political sort of, if you like, mechanism for engaging. They wanted to formalize it at a regional level. But the problem with anything like this is, firstly, you've got to do the groundwork. You've got to get people to start to trust, what you're offering, and to have input. It can't be all one-sided. And it didn't seem like that happened.
With this one, yeah. So it'll take a bit more time.
A bit more talanoa.
Bit more talanoa that they need to be aware of. So, way forward, be friends to all. Is it, what if you were to advise the Fijian government on the way forward and how to deal with this? What would it be?
Well, I would obviously emphasize our foreign policy has been very successful for Fiji in the last decade. And we need to maintain, the focus on our foreign relationships. We need to maintain the professionalism of our foreign affairs personnel. We need to give this the attention it deserves. Other countries are going to continue to come offering gifts or, wanting to get, partnerships in place. And we need to be very smart, about how we choose, what to engage in and with whom. It's a very, obviously, the world out there, not very friendly sometimes. We have to always be aware that other countries will have their own interests and agendas. And we've got to keep our own interests at the forefront of everything.
And be prepared for all these overtures that will come our way. Dr. Sandra Tarte, thank you for joining me on Simpson today.
Thank you.
That was the show for the evening. Join me again next Thursday at the same time. Good night.